and welcome to today's book forum on Gary Shapiro's latest book, Pivot or Die: How Leaders Thrive When Everything Changes. My name is Jennifer Huddleston, and I'm a Senior Fellow in Technology Policy here at the Cato Institute. I'm looking forward to a very exciting conversation on a wide array of issues going on in innovation today with an excellent panel featuring the author himself, Gary Shapiro, as well as two commentators who are experts in the field of tech policy, Jessica Malugan and Chris Lewis. Before we get started, I'd like to remind both our audience here in the auditorium at Cato, as well as online, that we will be taking questions. If you're joining us online, you may join the conversation and submit questions directly on the event webpage, Facebook, or YouTube, and on X using the hashtag #CatoEvents. So to kick us off, Gary Shapiro is an acclaimed author, lobbyist, and CEO of the Consumer Technology Association, better known as CTA, which represents over 1,300 consumer technology companies and is probably very well known for producing the show CES, which it allows users from all over the world to see what's coming up in innovation on the global stage. The book Pivot or Die is his fourth book. So Gary, you know, a lot of this book is really aimed at those entrepreneurs or the business community who may be developing some of the technologies that CTA represents or are exhibited at CES. But what do you think is the most important takeaway in this book for the policy community?
Well, first, thanks to Cato and you, Jennifer, for having me. This is a great forum. We're big fans of Cato. It's very consistent with a lot of the philosophy in the tech industry in terms of what you talk about, and we appreciate your advocacy. I think the biggest takeaway of the book is that as human beings, we make a lot of decisions in our lives. Those lives are, in a business context, very important, and also in a personal context. How we make those decisions is very important. Most of the decisions ultimately are inconsequential, but at the time they seem very significant. The challenge is we as human beings are focused on preserving the status quo. We can't help it. But the very definition of technology and innovation is that we're challenging the status quo. And our whole association exists because of a focus on innovation and a belief that innovation will make life better. It will solve fundamental human problems in healthcare, food production, clean air, clean water, community. So many different aspects where we have conflicts now and we have needs now around the world, technology is going to resolve. It's a question of how we get there. For those of us at CTA, our biggest fear is that if we don't do our jobs right, Congress or state legislatures or Europe or some other well-meaning people are going to do something which will choke off a whole branch of innovation. And we see that all the time. But for entrepreneurs, you know, they're just trying to make a living. They're trying to get seed capital. And we're seeing some horrible things going on in Washington now, which are really unacceptable to the whole concept of U.S. technology innovation. I mean, never in my lifetime did I think I would see a leader of our government going overseas and urging their government to sue one U.S. company trying to buy another U.S. company and kill a merger and acquisition. Never did I think I'd see some of the same person basically saying that big companies should not be allowed to buy small companies. If you want to start a business, you need seed capital. That's just a fact. And you're going to get it from people who believe that they will have an exit, or they're really amazing friends with a lot of money they want to throw away. But the reality is, if you don't have that exit of a big company buying you, you're limited to internal growth, perhaps private equity, or going public. All of those are relatively rare for a small company getting bigger. So the acquisition, if that's thrown off the books, that's a problem. We have 1,300 members. 80% of them are small business. They are unified on this, especially the small business people, the VCs and the others, the smaller companies, which actually are a large part of our governance, including our chairman. She has just a handful of employees. Our last chairman is a serial investor and a VC. This is an emotional issue with them. They want to see the U.S. succeed. They want to see investment. And to choke off that is unfair. So what's the big takeaway of the book on a policy perspective? Don't let government screw up what we are best at in the world, in the U.S., we are great at innovation. We are great at entrepreneurship. We're great at creativity. We have diversity, which produces incredible flow of ideas. We attract the best and brightest from around the world. If you look at most of the big tech companies, a good portion, if not most, are headed either directly first generation or second generation by immigrants. Really smart people with great ideas. This is what makes us great. And it does hurt us in the sense that we are very diverse, so we argue over issues that homogeneous countries don't even really spend time on, whether it be abortion or other social issues or gun control or things like that. We spend all our time fighting over things which actually, in terms of the future of the country, may be less significant from an economic point of view, because we need what we produce here, and what our export is innovation. And we're losing sight of that. We think somehow our success is a God-given right that we will always have. And it's not. And we're watching it. It's in danger of filtering away. And we're seeing that even in the presidential debates. They're debating about how big the tariffs should be rather than whether or not tariffs are good or bad for the country. And that's the kind of thing that I think is sending us in a very wrong and entitled direction. So the thesis of the book is don't sleep. If you're an innovator, we have to make good decisions as a country. We have to make good decisions as innovators and entrepreneurs. And we have to make good decisions in our personal life. And it goes into all those three things.
The title of the book talks about pivots. And in the book, you talk about how there are pivots both big and small, some that we may very clearly see and some that we as users might not always know about. This includes both the pivots that we see businesses make, as well as the pivots or the innovations that change our everyday lives as consumers. What are some of the recent pivots you've observed that have you the most excited about their potential impact on the future?
Well, one of the healthy pivots I see is we are, as a nation, shifting to generative AI in a very strong way, because the transformative nature of that will be huge, or is huge. There are challenges. There are challenges with just getting it powered with electricity. We have an electricity shortage, which is necessary not only for that, but for this enormous industrial policy we have favoring electric cars. And also the next big pivot will be to quantum, which also uses a tremendous amount of electricity, but has the advantage of shortening usage time. So there's a lot of work to figure that out, whether it's a net positive or negative. But in terms of generative AI, that's the big thing. Obviously, government, actually, I think I'll say something positive about our government now. At least the Congress has taken a more deliberative approach. Chris and I were, I think, together before the Senate committee, and a lot of senators were walking and actually listening, and there was a great discussion, at least in our panel, and there were several other panels that we weren't part of, where we talked about the importance of generative AI and the concerns there. But here's how I view it. This is not just a U.S. issue. There are three parts to the world that are relevant here. One is China, and to a certain extent, Russia and North Vietnam and some other, I'm sorry, not North Vietnam. There are some other countries that are less than favorable to our way of democracy, of life. They're totalitarian. I'll just focus on China, then you could talk about Russia if you want to. But really, China, they are investing huge amounts in generative AI. They have graduated 1 million engineers a year. They have no privacy. Every person in China is socially ranked after a certain age. And that ranking determines whether or not they get to travel, where they are at a dating website, and it's based on their interactions with other people who are rated. It's based on whether they jaywalk or pay their bills on time or all these other criteria, and they get a score. That's not acceptable in our country for the government to do that. But the advantage China has, they have all the health records for over 1 billion people in one area. And that allows them to analyze those health records and figure out what works and what doesn't. That allows them to take all the advantages that we don't have of all this huge amount of data, no privacy. Switch to Europe, and Europe has a totally different version of the world. Europe they share our values. They value human rights, they value democracy, but they value privacy even more. And their privacy has basically shut down a lot of innovation in Europe, so that it's hard to come up with a major European company that's become a unicorn in the last 20 years, while we have literally dozens and dozens of the world's unicorns. We are like Goldilocks and the Three Bears. We want to get that porridge just the right temperature, so we have to balance our privacy, which we feel strongly about, but also our innovation, which is equally important to the success of the nation.
You know, there's a lot that we can dive into in that, and I'm sure we will in audience questions. One of the things I thought was really interesting when you list out the different types of pivots, oftentimes when we're talking about technology or we're talking about tech policy, we of course want to focus on those success stories and on that startup ecosystem and the kind of culture of success that has led to some of these leading companies that were initially started in garages or dorm rooms. But you also mentioned that there can be a failure pivot that can lead to important lessons as well. And it plays a necessary part of the market is not just these giant ideas that succeed, but also the ideas that sometimes don't work out. What do you think is most misunderstood about the role that failure can play, both for an individual business as well as for the future of innovation or policy?
Well, one of the beautiful things about the United States, which we lead the world in, is not only our diversity, but we have a culture where failure and starting up a business is actually viewed positively as an education. And you've actually eliminated something perhaps that you shouldn't be doing, or you've learned from it. In other cultures around the world, and I do travel a lot, and I talk to a lot of government leaders around the world, and they say, well, how can we be like the U.S.? I say, one thing is you could recognize that failure is actually just one step towards success. Very people start successful, and I give a lot of examples in the book, but very few companies started successful right away. So failure is a good thing. The other thing about failure is that I think the problem with success is that you think you're freaking smart. And you just might have been very lucky. You might have been just, your timing was right. And some of the failures are just timed wrong, or they're executed wrong, or whatever the issue is, or there's no real demand. But you learn from each failure. When I'm hiring, I love the fact that someone's worked at a small company and it's failed. That implies that they, first of all, they'll appreciate working with us. We're a little more secure, I hope. But second, that they've gotten an education. And that's how it is in our culture, which is really, really valuable. I don't know how we got to be that way, but we're very lucky that we are.
Yeah, there seems like there's a lot of different elements that play into the overall success of the U.S. in terms of that policy structure, both culture and how we've approached different policy issues. At this point, I want to bring in Jessica and Chris to the conversation. It's two of the leading tech experts here in D.C. as well. Jessica Malugan is the director of the Center for Technology and Innovation at the Competitive Enterprise Institute, also known as CEI. And Chris Lewis is the president and CEO of Public Knowledge. So to both of you, I'll start with Jessica, if you don't mind. What in the book resonated most with you in light of your work, and what, if anything, did you disagree with?
Well, first of all, thank you for the kind words about failing. Some of us will take that to heart in ways we aren't here to discuss today, but I think that's so important that we do live in a culture where you're allowed to try things and learn from that and fumble around. I think that's something that's lacking in other cultures, and I don't know how we got it either, but I'm grateful for it. So the part, obviously, that I paid the most attention to was when you talked about the trend in Washington right now on the big is bad. And I'd just be interested in your reaction to, I remember the last round where we had a national conversation of big is bad, and it was Walmart. Walmart did a lot of good, efficient things and benefited a lot of consumers, but Walmart was a painful, creative destruction process for a lot of small businesses. And I think what's interesting about the tech space, and I'm just going to use the Amazon example, the amount of small retail that's been able to take advantage of like a big company's scale and distribution is such an interesting marriage of both groups, right? The small and the big. People can have their quibbles with what the terms of those agreements are, but I think that we've seen this kind of resurgence of small retail because of Amazon's platform. And I think in the book you give a couple examples of how big tech and little tech need each other. And whether that's funding or coordinating products or services, I think that's not a point I hear discussed very much, but how it's not really small versus big in the same way that maybe we thought about advances in industry before. And I wondered if you had any thoughts about that.
Oh, I totally agree with it. So one of the reasons I took the job I did, because I went to CES for the first time as a consultant to the association, and I fell in love with this amazing free marketplace where every significant company was there. And the first board meeting I went to, I'll never forget it. And we tell our employees about it every year. And this is a long time ago. And it was they were debating whether to raise the cost at CES. And the chairman of the board said, look, we're the largest exhibitor. And it's a rounding error to us. We spend a lot more money on entertainment and travel. Building the booths is not the cost of the square footage. That's nothing. But we always have to make this show available so anyone with an idea could come here and they could access the thousands of retailers, distributors, press, potential partners, and media and get that. Because we need these companies for ideas. And the secret for small companies is that they're better than big companies at pivoting quickly, at moving quickly, at changing. It takes a while to make a decision in a big company, and they're always protecting the mother lode product. So innovation at big companies is challenging. So we have, at this show coming up, we'll have over 1,300 or 1,400 exhibitors in what we call Eureka Park, which is a special subsidized area for startups. And the people that come there are amazing. It's not only Walmart's CEO who told me he comes there, it's Mark Cuban, it's the Shark Tank people who come and they do their tryouts there, and all these others, and media from around the world, and distributors, and the big companies go there. Because what can they do? They don't only buy the company, they're looking for companies to invest in. They could be the first customer of that company. They could just be a partner to help them and mentor them and learn from each other. There's like a million ways they work together, and it's a beautiful thing in the marketplace, and it shouldn't be viewed as illegal or discouraging or things like that. And we have this attitude by people who have never operated a business, never even been to a business, never even been to a trade event like CES or a trade show. They have no clue, and they're banning things that are going on that are so healthy for our economy. In my mind, it's criminal, and it should never happen. And if we didn't have all these other bad things happen, a lot more members of Congress and others would be talking about it. So what do I think? I think big companies and small companies are part of an essential, beautifully working ecosystem. Now, do big companies ever buy a small company and shut it down? Yes, they do. They may do it for a good reason, that it's just that the product doesn't work. They really wanted the people, not the product. Or they might do it for a nefarious reason. I'm not going to deny that doesn't happen, but it's minuscule in the course of business events. That's just not what big companies do. They want to innovate, and they always face a make or buy decision. And the make or buy is, do I make it myself? It'll require several years and this amount of investment and maybe buy these patents or do this. Or do we simply buy a company that's out there and fuel it up quicker so we can compete with everyone else in the world? And sometimes it's a difficult decision. It's like we make that decision. Do we hire internally or do we use consultants? And lucky for the consultants in the town, we do both.
Chris, same question to you. What in the book resonated most with you given your work, and was there anything that you disagreed with?
Sure. First of all, congratulations on the book, Gary. It's a fantastic read. What resonated with me right away was, I think part of where you started, Gary, with your talk was the idea that life is change, and that if you're not going with the changes or figuring out how to adjust to the changes, then you're not succeeding. You had this quote in the book I noted down. It said, in business, if you stand still and don't change, the odds are high that some competitor will make your product or services cheaper, better, or more interesting. And that really puts a premium for business people on adaptation, on being open to new ideas, and resiliency. And you talk about that, and that really resonated with me. It's true in our work, we're a nonprofit organization, but we do policy work in a very dynamic field, tech policy. And I'm always telling my staff that, yes, we have core values in our mission that we adhere to, but we're constantly applying them to new innovations and new technology that are coming along so that hopefully we can get the benefits of them with whatever protections we may be concerned about. But it's always dynamic, it's always changing. So that very much resonated. And number two, what resonated was you had some great anecdotes in there about how sometimes tech policy is not zero sum, and where you had a value and you saw a proposal or some legislation that you maybe didn't like or your members didn't like, but you were able to find ways to make it a win-win situation. And when that is possible, I think we can get the balance that I'm talking about of having the greatness of innovation while maybe putting some guardrails around things that could take it too far. So those are the things that resonated with me. I have to, Gary, you know this, I have to disagree a little bit.
You don't have to.
I don't have to, okay. I wouldn't be me if I didn't say, I disagree a bit on the tech merger stuff. For us, it isn't a case of big being bad, but when...
Especially you.
That's right. Some things large are great. But every merger should be investigated or reviewed for its own merits, is what I would say. And some mergers can go through, But some mergers and some that have concerned us in the tech industry involve market dynamics that are a bit unique, that the tech industry has network effects that make it hard for consumers to move from one product to the next and take advantage of the competition that we like to see.
So let me ask, can I ask a question? So iRobot was founded by an engineer from MIT 30 years ago, and I knew him with his two other engineers, and they created this amazing thing. First it was with NASA to walk around the moon, but they realized there's no market there. So they created a consumer product called the Roomba, which became very popular, and then the Chinese copied it, and they were competing with the Chinese, and it was really affecting their company. And they had to be sold to scale up and do something better even. And they managed to sell themselves to Amazon. And the US regulators said, we can't stop this under US law, there's probably no chance. So they went to Europe, and they convinced Europe to stop it, and the day that was announced by Europe that they were stopping it, Cullen, who heads up that company, went back to his employees in Massachusetts, and he had to fire 300 of them. And now the future of the company is in question. And both Amazon and Cullen of iRobot, I mean, it got to the level of the CEO where he went on CNBC and said, I can't believe my government is doing this. Under what justification is that possibly an acceptable thing for a government to do?
Yeah, I think there are some instances where, Congress's own investigations have shown that some large companies really do see some company that is being successful that people know about, and they will buy it up and try to just take out competition that way. And there's also been practices of self-preferencing or special deals with other companies where they make sure that they don't compete against each other. I think that's largely what we saw in the successful antitrust case against Google recently. So I would say take it case by case.
How about that case?
The Google case?
No, the case of the iRobot. Or you could talk about another one.
The iRobot case? I mean, maybe that's...
Or like Spirit Airlines now. They're talking about bankruptcy because they're not allowed to be acquired. To me, I mean, there's just no rational sense. I started out as a law student doing antitrust law with former FTC lawyers in a law firm, and we would evaluate every case immediately and figure out, and I'd spend all night in the law library and figure out what the judge was likely to do. But there was a clear standard there. It was called the Consumer Welfare Standard, established under President Jimmy Carter, who also gave us deregulation of the airlines. And this is a Democrat. Yeah. They went and did all these amazing things. He suffered from a bad economy and wasn't reelected. And God bless the guy, he's just turned 100. But what he did was his administration establishing what is best for consumers as a standard of antitrust. And all of a sudden, now what's the standard? What's best to protect existing competitors that are complaining? I'm just like, I don't understand why it's bad. Like, why can't, this is like a Democrat thing. What's best for consumers? And the Republicans are the ones defending it. And the Democrats are saying, no, this is let's just get rid of the big companies. Yeah, I think not let them acquire stuff. So you don't think big is bad?
I wouldn't just say big is bad. I think that's an oversimplification that can lead to, blocking.
So what's the standard?
Because.
What's the standard?
I think that's why we have antitrust experts. I think that's also why we, folks like us have advocated for some guardrail rules that make certain practices in certain markets that lend towards monopoly to not be illegal, like certain self-preferencing.
If there were merger guidelines, that would be nice, but I think this administration eliminated them. So you don't even have any sense of predictability. I think one thing every business in America should have is a sense of what the law is rather than arbitrarily being determined by government regulators that are not even elected. They're just there. And it's just like they extort concessions. They do all these things. We have reached a level of antitrust in this country which is totally unprecedented. And if you want to go back in history, as you know, for most of the tech mergers and tech actions that were opposed by the government, Republican or Democrat, there was nothing there. I mean, you look back at the different search engines, you look back at what happened to Microsoft, you look back at even the best example, it's some people like AT&T. I mean, it's been put back together again. The regional Bell operating companies all of a sudden are now AT&T or Verizon. I mean, so the point is that when you're challenging tech, which is one of the easiest things to enter, you're making a big mistake. All you're doing is putting a harness around that company so they can't innovate. Instead, they're focused on lobbying in Washington and lawyers, and it's just a waste. It's a waste of societal resources. It's like the litigation tax every business in this country pays.
And just on that point about kind of some of the unintended bureaucratic forces, I wrote a paper earlier this year about sort of the VC funding, how that's going with more uncertainty in the merger and acquisition legal situation. And I spoke to one VC, or he's like a medium fund guy, and he kind of does his own thing. And he says, I think what this is going to unintentionally create is big VC, meaning in Washington here, all the big law firms have a lobbying wing, right? Because you're a client and we're going to take care of your stuff and then we're going to help you get your stuff done. And he says, I'm going to be out of business as a medium-sized guy because only the biggest VCs will be able to add that lobbying wing that says, oh, you want to do a merger and acquisition? Well, we have all the guys in Washington who are going to get you through that process. And in that way, and I don't think anyone intended for that to happen, and I don't think, that's the aim of any kind of antitrust law, it just takes that many more little guys out of the game on the VC side and on the entrepreneurial side, because maybe you look good enough to acquire in one situation, but they have to factor in all the costs now of pushing that through that many more hurdles. And I think just as a larger point, when you start meddling even with the best of intentions, it's going to have ripple effects. I think people need to be very careful, especially in tech. It moves so quickly. There's so much innovation. I'm all for guardrails when they're rule of law and property rights, but beyond that, you better make a pretty convincing case that you're going to do more good than harm.
Well, guardrails are fine if there's some rationale and they're aiming at a specific problem which has to be solved. For example, safety, physically human safety, and even in AI. Guardrails are fine, but creating rules that only big companies can comply with is an equally bad problem. And that's what Europe has done, essentially. And they make it very difficult for small companies to become big companies. And a lot of what our government is encouraging them to do, since they don't have their own big companies, is essentially put these huge multi-billion-dollar taxes or fees on U.S. companies. And I don't know how that's good for anyone's 401k or IRA here. I mean, it's just crazy. We believe in permissionless innovation. If you always have to go ask the government for approval, it's going to be like wearing a harness and trying to innovate. But if it's saying if there's a safety issue, a real issue, this is what you have to do, or if you're a certain size company, if we have antitrust guidelines, if we have all these things. But we've gotten rid of all the things that have made us great so there can be innovation. And we're making it much more difficult. And if we didn't have all these other issues we're dealing with in Washington, it's such a serious issue because when I go around the world, everyone looks at us and say, stop stealing our people, our best and brightest, and say, how do we be like you? How do we become great innovators? And we have everything we want. We have at least 30 crown jewel companies here, when if a country has one like that, they're thrilled. And I don't know what's stopping these companies from moving elsewhere, but why would we push them out and why would we discourage them? I mean, this is like a recipe for economic insanity. At the same time, we've created the biggest debt in our history and we have to finance it. And the only way we could finance it is through growth. Yes, do taxes have to go up? Good point. Does spending have to go down? Good point. But you know what? Growth makes all that a lot easier. And we need economic growth. We need innovation here. We're not going to be the world's best manufacturers in almost anything, but we could try. That's what both presidential candidates want. But reality, where we're going to get the value add and the money that will fuel our society and pay off our debt and our kids, rather than stealing from it, is going to come from economic growth. And economic growth is only going to come from innovation. It doesn't come from doing the same old thing over and over again.
So I want to make sure Chris has an opportunity to respond, but I think this is going to tee us up very well for the rest of our conversation about the kind of policy structures that we're seeing impacting Pivot. But I know, Chris, I want to give you a chance to finish or to respond to anything that Gary or Jessica said.
He just agrees.
No, I think that there was a good mix of stuff in there. There's some stuff that I've already said I disagree with. But I think in the end, what I want to emphasize that Gary said that I think is right is that guardrails can be good. Which guardrails are important and why are important? You make a case in there in your book for privacy as being a standard that we can set, and then it's certainty for all companies that has to be met. We don't have that in the U.S. It'd be great to have it. I know you guys are at the table, open to those ideas. What guardrails we have matter. I think there are certain practices you may disagree with that should not be allowed, but we can agree to disagree with those. I do think there are win-wins, and you've given some examples in the book of where you've negotiated them. Your negotiation on the 21st Century Communications and Video Accessibility Act, the story I'd never heard of about airplane mode. I'd never heard that story before. Read the book, you guys. But it just shows where you found something that you disagree with, and then you found a compromise. And so those are the sorts of things we're looking for.
How do you feel about AM radio being mandated in cars? That's what Congress is spending time focusing on. I mean, like, it was in the Wall Street Journal, there's a commentary yesterday, but I can't believe I'm spending time. We turned 100 years old. We started out as AM radio, and every other industry would love to have their product mandated. This to me is like, I can't believe we just given billions and almost trillions of dollars to promote electric cars, and now we're burdening them with something that's unnatural in that high electromagnetic radiation environment that almost no one listens to anymore. And this is what Congress is on their way to mandating through their vote a few weeks ago from the Commerce Committee.
I think this raises an opportunity for kind of a really good bigger picture question. You've hit on some of these throughout in the conversation around antitrust or data privacy or AM radio even. How do you think, and to the panel in general, that technology policy can encourage or discourage companies and innovators from being able to pivot? You mentioned, Gary, the need for guardrails or certainty, but also the concerns about going too far down, for example, the European path, where you have a lot of certainty that says, stop, you can't do that. So what do you think about in terms of what does an approach look like that really encourages companies to have that adaptability, or are there very certain things that you're concerned about that might discourage the ability to pivot as well?
I could throw out one that we haven't talked about yet is the power of openness and sharing of technology. The internet helped jumpstart that, and we've been fighting for openness in technology and the internet ever since. There are efforts in Europe that people have tried to duplicate in the US that would lock down the openness of the internet and the sharing of information, whether it's link taxes or other over-enforcement of copyright regimes. Those sorts of things, I think, run counter to what we've learned works for innovation and what has worked for both companies and for consumers online, that they value the community building nature that comes with sharing and linking online. So that, and the other one I would say, and I hope you guys would agree with, because Gary, you guys work with standards, and if there were some way, I don't know if it's through your trade association or if the government can help, but ways to promote interoperable standards as new technologies come along, I think that promotes competition as well and makes it easier for consumers to have choices.
We're pretty good at standards. We have just in 30 health technology standards alone in the last couple of years because health technologies is a big deal. Certainly Section 230, the threats there are attacks on the First Amendment. User-generated comments are something that's real. There are problems, obviously, there are issues. It's really difficult, though, for the platforms to comply with them. And they have to be the combination of the UN, the State Department, and they have to do it by country. And it's just a Sisyphean task. But the reality is when you have a free democracy and freedom of speech, there are risks that are out there. And there's certain things that everyone agrees on, like most everyone, child pornography, things like that, human sex trafficking. There's a lot of issues of agreement, but then there's issues where there's no agreement, and we're in danger because you want to throw out the bathwater with the bath, or whatever the expression is.
There's a baby in there somewhere.
There's a baby in there. You don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater. Got it. And then there are other issues, but I think things that promote certainty. As I said, I think we got to get rid of the litigation taxes that our U.S. companies uniquely pay. We have too many lawyers. I'd like them to become English teachers personally, or factory workers, or something more productive. But getting a law degree is literally a license to sue. And in the District of Columbia, where we are today, 1 out of 11 people are lawyers. And that's the highest in the country. But still, the point is that anywhere you go, you see the billboards. Anyone with a new idea, it just slows down companies. It's non-productive. It makes us non-competitive. And it's kind of the rest of the world looks at us and thinks we're crazy. So I think going to a loser pays scenario would help for a lot of reasons, and that would be great. I also think getting the best and brightest here is important. That is what we export in part, is our educational system. To the extent people from around the world come here and we convince them to stay, it's a good thing because they are the ones that are really the seed corn for our best companies, our new companies, our challenges to the status quo. And we have to recognize that a diverse society is actually, there's benefits there. I mean, certainly we are arguing over things others don't, as I said earlier, but the advantages outweigh the disadvantages totally. And our immigration system is one thing we have to challenge, and there should be a point system of some type about who we want and who we don't. And for some reason, that's like not cool to talk about, that we don't want some people, but we don't. We obviously don't want people that have committed crimes elsewhere. We obviously don't want people who are going to be total burdens to our system. But instead, the whole system revolves around, if you're here legally, you can bring anyone in your family, and it's chain migration which goes on there. And my wife, as a doctor, tells me that she sees a lot of patients that don't speak English. They come here, they're brought here by their kids, and they just take from the system. And it could be that you have to pay for those people if you're bringing them here. So there's a lot of ways of having discussions around these items and curing these things. And the other is, obviously, we're very conscious, especially with CES, is we need role models for all elements of society. The challenge that we see and have identified is, how does that funding start for an entrepreneur? How does it get there? Well, if you're going to give your hard-earned after-tax money to somebody, you're going to want someone you trust. And it is human nature to give to someone that looks like you, of your genetic gender rather, of your color skin. And that's just a fact. You're more comfortable then. I don't know how you could change that, but what we've tried to do, we've created a fund, and it gives money. We're up to over $10 million, probably going higher soon, where we're giving to funds that invest in women, that invest in startups of underrepresented groups, that invest in veterans, that invest in others that are smart people that deserve a chance and deserve that start. And we also do it at CES in terms of role modeling and getting people out there, diverse people speaking in positions so kids will want to go into that. A lot of money's been put out. There's no easy answers on this. But if we recognize it's a societal value to have everyone have that type of opportunity at the front end early, I think it's a good thing.
Jessica, anything you want to add?
I mean, I think I have something to agree with here from everyone, because I think finding the common sense solutions are something we don't see enough of anymore. Washington generally, and certainly in tech policy, it's become charged with a lot of emotional input that doesn't have a lot to do with maybe, looking at the facts and how things actually work, and the need for, if we might disagree on what the rules of the road might be, but certainly we can agree it's better to have less uncertainty, and let's stick with the rules of the road in a more bipartisan, or I don't even know if we can say bipartisan. I don't know what the word is for absolutely everyone who's shouting.
Is the word compromise? Is that a dirty word now?
I think it is.
Yeah.
I don't know if we're allowed to see, this is on television, so I'm not sure what the standards are for that. But I think there needs to be more of that across the board in policy, and listening to each other and trying to understand a bit more about how things work, and also starting from the position that even people you don't disagree with, they aren't bad people. They're not stupid. They just have a different opinion than you do. And a lot more can be gained by having those conversations in a rational, respectful way. I don't know how you infuse tech policy with that, but I'm here for it if anyone's up for it, so am I. And we're doing that today.
This is like the vice presidential debate.
Well, I don't know how to take that. Is that a compliment, or?
I found it refreshing that they talk to each other.
Okay. I'm gonna take that I'm gonna take it as a win.
I'm going to bring us back to the term pivot, which I thought was, a really interesting choice, because I think oftentimes when we think about technology and we think about change, we think about those big disruptive moments, things like AI or the internet coming about. And I was on another panel, and one of my co-panelists there made the comment that AI ceases to be AI when it's part of our everyday lives. And that, when we start to see these technologies incorporated, they quit being disruptive, they quit being these huge things. But pivots are still happening, even in established technologies, but also oftentimes on the margins. So to the panel as a whole, what do you think are some of those currently overlooked pivots that we might be seeing that are leading to a lot of benefits for consumers, or are causing real change, but maybe the kind of small type of pivots?
In technology? Well, we've pivoted intentionally as a country through our Congress to electric vehicles with billions and billions of dollars spent. And I live in Detroit, I commute here, and let me tell you, Detroit's hurting because they've done that. And it's not working out the way people thought. There are a lot of challenges with electric vehicles, and there's also a lot of the research that was the basis of the sales projections was based on Tesla owners which were second car owners of a certain demographic, and they had a great experience. And I think it's, a company like Toyota has gone to hybrid. There's both the Obama and Trump administrations were very focused on self-driving. One of our big problems is healthcare costs. Well, car accidents cause 40,000 deaths and several hundred thousand of hospital admissions every year. And if we could cut those even by half, because almost all of them are human error, that would save a lot of healthcare costs. And it would also free us up, a lot of us up who want it, from driving, and we could also be much more productive. There'll be all sorts of new car opportunities. Think about it, if you're a car maker, you could have a car that's like a bedroom, you could have a car that's like an office, you could do all sorts of things with a car. It could be a home entertainment center. So the car makers were very excited about that under Obama and under Trump, and all of a sudden it was cut off by this administration. The unions really wanted us to go to electric. For some reason, they thought that was better. They got a lot of money for that. And now we are where we are, where we're pushing electric on everyone. And frankly, it's just doesn't have the pickup that the planners, the central planners of government has. And that's the problem with central planning and industrial policy. I'd rather say, let's focus on things which will allow us to compete in the rest of the world and have some national standards for some of these things, which is where in self-driving, Congress had actually, the House of Representatives passed it almost unanimously. And then the trial lawyers got involved, and the trial lawyers said, we want our piece because the number one lawsuit in the United States is car accidents, and we get a lot of money from this. So the carnage industry has helped fight and kill this along with the unions, and we're suffering in the rest of the world. That has nothing to do with the question you asked, because you wanted a success story.
Well, I know. I just was saying overlooked pivots. What are the types
healthcare
of
technology.
policies? So
Healthcare technology is a huge pivot that's working out really well. COVID forced us to start doing remote health in terms of having telehealth, also having remote devices. There's a huge shift going on that's embraced by almost everyone at this point. It allows caregivers not to take people back and forth from the doctor. It's green. There are some downsides. You don't get the same full experience, just the way there's downsides in a Zoom call versus the face-to-face live experience a lot of us love. But I'll tell you, it's good for society.
Yeah.
I'll give you another happy pivot is the reopening of 3 Mile Island nuclear energy, I think is a pretty cool, happy pivot. Talk about government overreacting and kind of stifling an industry that could be a wonderful choice among power generation and one that's, without the kind of emissions that most people are worried about today. So I like that perhaps AI and Quant's big appetite for energy is making people make some big, bold moves in terms of powering the U.S. in the future.
Not only do I agree with that, but we're having a special set of sessions at CES just on energy production, which we've never had before. We discussed it over a year ago when we got the utilities and others together in a private meeting. And then I realized there really is no plan for any of this, and the numbers just don't add up. What generative AI uses is extraordinary, and obviously electric cars, that's part of the equation. Electric cars do actually use electricity that has to come from somewhere, and we're betting all this without doing the math, and there's no great utility plan. That's why I agree with you totally.
Chris, anything to add before I turn to audience questions?
I'm really excited about the pivot that the Commerce Department has made to look at open source and open model weights in AI. That, again, I believe openness in technology fosters more innovation. And so we'll see where that takes us. But the hope is that it will promote greater competition, so just not the largest players who can afford to do the deep research in AI can get into that space. I'm also excited by, in the tech industry, the pivot from folks who may have looked at Web3 and decentralized web technologies as purely a speculative thing to think about how it can create protocols to create open platforms. I think that's a good use of that technology and something that we're excited to see where it goes.
So I am going to turn to audience Q&A. We have some questions online, but for those of you in the auditorium, we will have a microphone brought to you, and if you could please say your name and affiliation. So I'll start with a question from the audience down here in the front row.
Mark Lerner, Ayn Rand talked about the sanction of the victim, where companies would just allow themselves to be regulated just to go along. What do you think of Facebook going before Congress and asking to be regulated? And also, do you have any comments about the fears of children using these social devices?
I'll let whoever on the panel wants to start.
You want me to start?
I'm happy, but go ahead.
I'll believe it when I see it. Facebook says they want to be regulated, but then they run a big marketing campaign against certain regulations. So again, when you talk about regulations, as we were saying, and we have a lot of disagreement up here between us on it, it comes to what regulation? Facebook also went before the government and said that they were somehow wrong in moderating content. I think moderating content is good. That's why we defend Section 230, because it promotes each platform making the choices instead of the government making the choices about what the content moderation is. So it depends on what sort of regulation you want.
Go ahead.
No, you go ahead. You wrote the book.
Say, as a parent of one teenager and almost teenager, this is a hot issue in our household. I believe parents have a very big responsibility that many of them are evading. Like, we didn't let our kids watch television. We don't let our 12-year-old use have a telephone. He uses it only if it's a special situation. And we had an event recently where we had over 30 kids, and we had executives, and we asked the kids what they thought should be allowed with the phones. And shockingly, the kids kind of agreed that, look, we're in a real-world situation. We need our phones in schools because we're scared about shooters and emergencies. But why can't you just put the phones somewhere where we can't get out of them in the classroom unless we need them? So, I think they're reasonable, and a lot of schools are going in that direction. States are going in that direction. I think this issue is being worked out. On the other hand, I still think that even with that, there are issues involving, suicide of kids, shaming of kids, bullying of kids, and these are really difficult questions. And I think that, we started this out as a country and a society that agreed upon with children's advertising. That if you go aiming at something kids, we have a right to restrict people with kids. And by the way, we also have a right as parents to punish our kids and do all sorts of stuff. Kids are not fully adults. They're not, although Hillary Clinton actually did groundbreaking work in this area, kids have rights, but they're limited. And Hillary Clinton actually expanded them, shockingly, which no one's ever talked about, even in her own campaign for president. But I believe that we have a responsibility as a society towards children, and that means to set appropriate regulations. And there's different things. Devices are doing different things. There's things that are coming out through the marketplace. But we're not there yet. And it's almost a situation where we have to do something about it. And it's a good idea that I think if the American Academy of Pediatrics, which we work for on children's television viewing, or if others get together and say, look, how do we solve this problem? Because it is a real problem, and we can't afford to ignore it. And by the way, it's just not a U.S. problem. This is a global problem. We have mental health issues that are coming out around the world. And at first, they were just affiliated with COVID, but that was just contemporaneous time. And in deeper research has showed it's really the devices themselves and what's on it and how kids are spending hours a day. And those kids are not as mentally healthy as other kids that don't spend those hours a day on it.
Jessica, I know you've done some work in this area too. Anything
Yes,
to add?
some of that work is having 2 children. It's been the hardest and most rewarding part of the research. I think this goes back probably to an answer that's been given so many times on this stage. Not every problem has a policy solution. It doesn't mean there aren't policy solutions, but I think that the problem with over-regulating, some of the extreme that, just ban kids under this age outright, you run into a lot of other problems there. And I think also what you do is you kind of short circuit the emerging market for tools to help parents. Like if it's as big of a problem as we think it is, there's a lot of incentive for someone to come along and help and fix that problem. And I think we're really in early days. It doesn't feel like that to us, right? Because we sleep with our phone and live with our phone, and it feels like it's always been with us. But really in terms of the learning curve on this, we're not that far into it. And I really think the same entrepreneurial spirit that we've been talking about here today will probably help parents. It is hard. I'm exhausted. I'm tired. I'm over it. I get it. Yeah. But it's part of being a parent today. It's part of my responsibilities. And when I was a kid, there were lots of other more physical dangers out there, right? And a lot of the stories you hear are terrible, awful stories. But when you kind of sort through them, you realize it's things that were facilitated online, and that's a problem. And I think a lot of people are doing their best to keep kids safe. But I grew up with images of Kate Moss and people selling drugs in the high school parking lot. So, I don't know that it's really, I don't know that the problems are new. I think the circumstances are new, but I think, we're America. We can figure this out. We can adapt to that and we can do better. And I think, especially on the kids' safety stuff, I think everyone has that interest at heart. I really do.
I'm going to pull one of the questions from our online audience now. How can a company raising venture capital de-risk the regulatory unknown, especially given tax policies and other variables to secure investment? So any thoughts on kind of how this regulatory uncertainty may be impacting venture capital?
Well, what you said about large VCs, I'd never heard, but I understand it, and I'm fearing it. So it doesn't de-risk it. It's just, you could go with a large VC, I guess, but I don't think that's a good competitive marketplace for venture capital. I think you could let your elected representatives know this is an issue and support and vote for people that recognize it's an issue. I mean, when President Trump was first elected, what he said was, and by executive order, was I'm going to get rid of 2 regulations for every new rule. And I was asked about it at a Senate hearing, and I mean, this is a very rough instrument, but it's very necessary. We are dying by 1,000 cuts now these last few years, and it's been very difficult to do business. And, to be honest, other than business, most of America doesn't pay attention to what happens in Washington at the regulatory agencies. So, Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren got their way with us, and they got all their people running these important agencies. And it's hurting us as a nation. It's hurting our competitiveness. It's hurting our ability to do business. And there's so much going on. Now, there's a Supreme Court decision, which is very clear that Congress is the one that's in charge here. And unless they've given the authority to an agency, very clearly it doesn't have it. So a lot of these rules would be fought out now in the courts. But in terms of advising a specific VC, just like we have had to deal with patent trolls, which have dried up a lot of VC funding in that area. And Mark Warner has said himself, he sees the problem because he lost a lot of funding for one of his businesses that had a patent just threat aimed at them. And we know a lot of businesses get these threatening letters or they have regulatory agencies, and it's just not healthy for democracy and free entrepreneurship.
Jessica and Chris, any further thoughts?
I'd start with this is why, even though we disagree sometimes, it's important to engage with trade associations so that you combine your power if you're a small player, because I think there are policies out here that can be harmful to innovation. I've named some. And I think then it's also incumbent upon those companies and those small startups, those investors, to think about what they can live with, because then you can find the win-wins. I named one with finding baseline privacy rules. So I think it's both of those. And when we can find win-wins, or we can find ways to lift up the story of entrepreneurs and what they need to survive, we can balance some of those values.
Jessica?
Yeah, I think this is less of a suggestion and more just empathy, but it's just a rough time out there for the little guys to grow, because the Sarbanes-Oxley made IPOs more expensive, and not every small guy is a fit for that, right? If you're doing one little specific thing, you have a much better shot of being purchased as like almost outsourced R&D than going public. And I think that right now, the bar is very low for them to at least take a look at you and cost you some, the second round of these filings is already like, the first round is like the second round used to be. And I think it's a burdensome time. I would just say, hang in there, because the way things change in Washington, I hope the pendulum starts to swing a little bit more towards innovation.
And I'm going to turn back to our live audience for our next question.
Is that Robert Atkins?
Thanks. Steve Del Bianco with NetChoice. Gary, I was lucky enough to sell my small company to a large company. But what I remember is the harder I worked, the luckier I got. So luck is a factor, but hard work contributes. I bought your Audible version today because I just can't wait to hear you reading it to me in person. And I strongly encourage the rest of you try it. And Gary, what I'm really interested...
Is that a serious comment?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
When you say we got to get the emotion out, I said, why not? We should be passionate about our position.
You should. And I can't wait to hear your reading about the block pivot. right? Where you're forced to pivot. Because while companies may need to pivot away from regulation and litigation, I do hope that your book advocates that they turn to their trade associations and allies to hurry up and change the regulation and litigation environment. While they had to pivot around it, we need to change the way government overreach happens at the same time the company's moving so we can move the country in the right direction.
So I'm big on questions and a question mark, so I'm going to turn that into a question mark. For those who have not yet read the book, can you tell us a little more about what the block pivot is and how that may be playing out in policy right now?
Can you? There's something called the forced pivot, which is you don't have a choice. COVID comes along, you got to decide. And I don't want to say there was any beauty to COVID, but the silver lining of that very dark cloud was that every company of any significant size had to pivot. Until then, I felt a lot of companies in different industries, they just looked at each other and they all assumed the same set of and they do the same thing because no one else assumed that the other people looking at the same thing and taking the same path. So we were becoming lazy and copying. COVID, totally different experience now. Everyone went in different directions. There's more innovation in the last few years since COVID, not only in healthcare, but in many areas in different directions. So I think that's great. But a forced pivot is one where you really don't have a choice and you have to act to survive. And I think there's value in that. Obviously, some people will make it, some people won't. I mean, the challenge of capitalism in the free market system is there are casualties. One of the advantages we didn't even mention is the word bankruptcy, or maybe I did before in Spirit Airlines, but the bankruptcy has the advantage of providing a rational system for allowing a company to either go under or be reorganized. And that's an advantage we have that other countries don't. So although no one really wants bankruptcy unless you're trying to avoid major litigation, which some companies are now using, it's a part of the system. So you have to be very clever and come up with and look at your assets. Now, in some of the names of major companies, like you could take retailers like Sears and Circuit City, or you could take manufacturers like RCA, a lot of traditional names. All they have left is their name. And they basically license it out to others that use it and benefit. There's a huge amount of that going on in almost every sphere of industry where the name is the only value left. Radio Shack's another great example. Someone bought that name. And there's a whole newsletter called the Licensing Newsletter, and it talks about all this stuff. And it's fascinating because you just have a brand. You don't have anything else. So what can you do, though? You do what you have to do to survive, and that's what makes this country great.
So I think we have time for one more question.
I have a question for you.
Oh, no.
You're with Cato. What do you think about all this?
I'm going to go to our audience question because I don't have enough time in 3 minutes to give a full answer. So I
3 minutes, okay.
Just wanted to be polite to the host. I didn't bring a bottle of wine.
I appreciate it, and I will be happy to talk about my own research, which I greatly appreciate you giving me the opportunity to do at our reception afterwards.
Okay.
So.
J.P. Hogan, write about politics, but I'm wondering how the industry is dealing with that. Buildings could put batteries in them now and have their own low voltage system. We could get away from all our battery devices that can run on low voltage and actually, instead of plugging into megawatts, plug into a system that's generating locally to have. So we have so much device and our lighting can all be low voltage now. Just wondering, are you working? It looks like you're not working the issue.
Yeah, it's definitely you.
Looking for the technology side of it.
We're out.
You were talking about the energy loads and all
I
this.
have an answer and that I understood your question. But we were in Sweden, and we toured a plant there, which was phenomenal, because what it did was use the solar panels for a lot of small devices. And I was so inspired, I started looking into the field, and I talked about that'd be great for window shades. Like, why do we have to plug them in and charge the battery every year? And then I got this device from my apartment here where I just leave it out by the shades, and it comes back, and it's solar powered, stores things. So there are opportunities, especially in the handheld marketplace, the tablet marketplace, the phone marketplace. But still, you're not going to have too many solar powered cars. I'm sorry? Perhaps. I mean, I was talking to someone yesterday about the first time I went to Vietnam. No, I didn't serve, but I went as a quasi-tourist, and being one of the first boat rides on the Mekong Delta in a Bosik boat. At night, all you see these little TV lights all around, and people are taking car batteries and are using them to power TV sets and refrigerators because that was their source of electricity. I'm not suggesting we do that, but I think we have a long way to go in energy storage and development. I mean, why can't we harness all these winds that are coming into Florida, or all the electricity comes from storms? I mean, we're going to get places, and I agree with you 100% on nuclear. We got to get there. We got to do things differently, and we have to be smarter. But these are problems that people need to be able to solve inside a regulatory environment or change the regulations.
Gary, I can see the low voltage section of the CES floor next year. It's going to be great.
Amazing.
I don't know anything about this. This is,
Well, I'm going to take this opportunity to pivot us to wrapping it up and thank our audience and as well as our panelists for being here. As Gary tried to allude to, this is certainly a lot of the research that we're doing on the technology policy team here at Cato around issues related to competition, AI, online speech. A lot of these conversations are conversations that we're both continuing to have in our research as well as try and facilitate these kind of conversations. So if you'll please join me in thanking our panelists today. For those of you that are here with us in person, we will have continued conversations and refreshments outside in the Winter Garden. And for those of you who have been joining us online, this now concludes our event. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Good job.
Nice to meet you, Chris.
This is great. Yeah.
That was
Thank
fun.
you.